So I'll repeat just the first line because the first line has been asked many times. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Here, the curfew is the bell that rings in the church clock. So in every churches, there is a clock which tells the time of the day. So this is the same curfew, I mean the bell which is ringing in the church. So here the poet starts with that the clock of the church is making a sound that indicates that the day is parting and evening is arriving. So now I'll move on to this is the last stanza that we have covered last day.
May I try?
Yes, sure. I thought you are not able to connect.
So there's problem with my device, so I couldn't hear you taking my name. So, but still, I would like to
Sure.
help you with this.
Sure.
So, as far as I understood, some villagers were like Hamden. And who was Hamden? He was John Hamden. He was a political personality who was there in the Civil War. He contributed to the Civil War of 1642 and opposed bureaucracy of Charles I. He was against the rule of Charles I and he was against the bureaucracy of Charles I. And the writer is saying that some villagers are as fearless as Hamden. Why was Hamden fearless? Because he had the guts to raise his voice against the tyranny of Charles I. Okay, so here it says some village Hamden that with dauntless meaning fearless, breast meaning courage. Okay, that with dauntless breast, the little tyrant of his fields withstood. So they were able to withstand the villagers who were like Hamden. They were able to withstand the atrocities done by the people who were from a rich background. Okay, just like the zamidars that we used to have in India. Okay, like fearless Hamden, they must have withstood domination of tyrant, rich people. And some people were like John Milton. John Milton was somebody who was unrecognized and he was inglorious. He was not able to get the kind of recognition he deserved in his lifetime. And then Gray says some are like Oliver Cromwell. Some villagers were like Oliver Cromwell, who were without any guilt of country's blood. And let me read it again. Some mute inglorious Milton here may rest. Okay, some Cromwell guiltless of his country's blood. And in the last lines, the author is trying to say that some villagers were like Oliver Cromwell. He was also a political personality, a leader of England. Okay, and it says that he was somebody who did not have any regrets. He was completely he believed himself to be somebody who was free of guilt, and in his own way he tried to support the countrymen of his nation. So in a positive stride, he's the author, the poet, Gray is trying to say that some people were like Cromwell, and in the initial lines he's saying some people were Milton, who were unrecognized, and some people were like Hamden, and all the villagers who. Just a minute. Yes, and here he categorizing the villagers, and he's saying that all these kinds of villagers who are no longer alive are under the are under the grave, under the burial site. So this is what I've understood out of this.
Just very right. You are absolutely right here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, I'll move on to the next stanza, which reads like the applause of listening senates to command, the threats of pain and ruin to despise, to scatter plenty over a smiling land and read their history in nation's eyes. So in the previous stanza, we saw that the poet is talking about all those villagers who are buried in the churchyard. So here poet says that the situation of the villagers were that much poor that they were not able to receive the applause of the politicians. Applause of listening senates. Senates means politician. So whenever the politicians speak, people applaud for them. But these people have no such power for whom somebody can applaud. So that means the dead villagers situation kept them away from receiving the applause and approval of the politicians. The threats of pain and ruin to despise. The situation of these village men made them in such a way that they were able to blow off the threats of pain and ruin. The situation made it impossible for them to blow off threats of pain and ruin. The situation was that much poor for them that it was impossible for them to blow off the threats of pain and ruin. They were in pain all the time. To scatter plenty over a smiling land. That means nor could they spread good stuff all over the country. So in nation's eyes, and read their history in nation's eyes, that means nobody will be reading about their life in the history. They will not appear in the history books. In the nation's eye, they never appear in the history. And they have not scattered too many things over the smiling land because they have not got the opportunity. And here at the end of the stanza, you will find one caesura. Caesura means the line is enjambment. The meaning is not complete here. It's moving on to next stanza. Caesura means there is no full stop at the end of the stanza. So the poet is taking a pause here. So in the poetry, a pause is known as caesura. And it is also called enjambment. That means the meaning is not complete in its own line. It has to move on to the next line to understand the complete meaning. So I'll complete the next stanza as well. And then I'll ask someone of you to explain these two stanzas together.
Sir, I haven't understood the last two lines, to scatter till nation's eyes.
Okay, fine.
Maybe because there's some problem with my device. I don't know. I cannot hear you properly today.
Okay. What about other scholars? Am I audible to other scholars clearly?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay, the last two lines says that to scatter plenty over a smiling land. As I said, that the people were having lots of pain and ruin. And they were not having that much of wealth that they can scatter or distribute among other people. And that is the reason that they could not be recognized. They do not appear in any of the history books. In the eye of the nation, they are not the great people. They never appear in the history because they had not much to scatter, not much to distribute, not much to give away to other people. Got it?
Yes, sir. Sir, please. Sir, please explain the first line once again.
Okay, fine. I'll explain this stanza, complete stanza again. The applause of listening senates to command. Whenever the senates, I mean the politicians, speak, the people generally applaud or clap for them. But here the villagers' situation is so poor that they do not receive any such applause. And nobody applauds for them. whenever they listen to these villagers. Like when the people listen to the senates to command, they generally applaud. So here said, the applause of listening senates to command, the threats of pain and ruin to despise. So pain and ruin was ignored. Pain and ruin was there in their heart. The threats of pain and ruin was there in their heart, but it was despised, it was ignored. Nobody could listen to them. And they were so poor that they could not scatter plenty of wealth over their smiling land, over the people of England. And that is the reason that they could not be read in the history in the nation's eyes. Got it, Vijay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, move on to the next. Their lot forbade, not circumscribed alone, their growth virtues, but their crimes confined. Forbade to wade through slaughter to a throne, and shut the gates of mercy on mankind. Again, the poet is talking about the situation of the people. He says that the poverty of these villagers was not only prevented them from growing their virtues. Circumscribe means prevent. It not only prevented them from growing their virtues. And in the second line, he talks about the goodness of poverty. Till now, we have seen that the people, the villagers, were so much poor that the condition of them was worse. But now, in the all lines, all three lines, the poet is talking about what is the benefit, what is the goodness of becoming a poor or being in poverty. So he says that the poverty, in the first line he says that the poverty of the villagers not only prevented them from growing their virtues. Yes, their virtues could not grow because they were poor. But the same poverty, their growing virtues, but their crimes confined, but the same poverty prevented them from doing any crime. Because they were not having any greediness of wealth, so they did not did any crime. So because of this poverty, they prevented themselves from doing crime. And not only crime, it also forbids to wade through slaughter to a throne. As you know that this poem was written in 1751. It was published in 1751. And Thomas Gray has started writing this poem in 1742 itself. It is supposed that in the year 1742, when his friend Richard West died, so that year itself he has started writing this poem, and finally it was published in 1751. And if you remember about the assassination of Charles I in the year 1649, there Charles I was assassinated. He was slaughtered by the Puritans to get the throne. So here he says that because of, yes, anyone want to say anything?
Yes, sir. You told us while you were teaching Cavalier poets that Charles I was. It happened for the first time in England that a king was executed publicly, and Oliver Cromwell was the head of Puritans afterwards, and then his Richard came into on.
Yes, very right. That is the same thing here he is talking, that these poor people, they have never slaughtered any king to get over the throne. The way Charles I was slaughtered, he was executed. So these people never slaughtered anyone to get the throne, because they were in poverty, because they were poor. And shut the gates of mercy on mankind, and also prevented them for being merciless on mankind. So this poverty also made them merciless on mankind, because they were poor, because they were in poverty. Clear?
Explain this one, the applause of listening.
Okay, fine.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. In this stanza, the applause of listening senates to command. In this, the poet is trying to tell us that the dead villager situation was not so good that even the command they were not able to receive the command and the applause and the approval of the people there, of or you can say the politicians there. And in the second line, the threats of pain and ruin to despise, it says that the situation was so bad that it also made it impossible for them to have to blow off the threats of the pain and the ruin that they had. And then in the third line, to scatter plenty over a smiling land, and and also they could not spread the good stuff, or to spread the plenty of things all over the country. Even if they had they had knowledge, even if they had the knowledge, they were not able to spread the plenty of the things all over the country or to their countrymen. And then the third line, and read their history in a nation's eyes. So the last two lines connects by saying that they could not spread the good stuff all over the country, and even though they may if they spread the good things all over the country, uh, they can win some name in the around their people. But because they are not able to spread good things, so their name also would not be there in the history books, which where people would tell things about them, that they have spent good things or given good things. So it talks about their poverty,
Yeah,
that
that's
how their
great. That's
poverty
great.
affected.
That's great. Thank you, Suji. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, the next stanza by Vidyut.
Sir, in this stanza, the poet talks about the poor people that due to their poverty, they have the virtues, and due to their poverty has restricted them from doing the crime, and they are not the people who um, became the slaughter to the Charles I, and this gives them from the merciless like the people of the time, and it also like start the gates of mercy, and party, it also blessings for them, and gives them the mercy less from mankind. Last line, it also
Okay, thank you, Vidyut.
Should I extract most the stanzas?
Tanmay, you will get the chance for the next stanza. Okay. Okay, fine. Okay, should I move on to the next stanza?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. The next stanza is: the struggling pangs of conscious truth to hide, to quench the blushes of ingenious shame, or heap the shrine of luxury and pride with incense kindled at the muse flame. So yeah, this is a very beautiful stanza where the poet talks about the struggling pangs, the pain of the people who are suffering of poverty. They were struggling to hide the sharp truth of poverty. Conscious truth means the sharp truth. They were struggling to hide the truth of poverty. And in the second line, to quench. Quench means when a utensil is hot, if you put that hot utensil into the water, that is called quenching. So their situation of poverty kept them from trying to hide their true feelings. They had the true feelings. They also wanted to get educated. They had lots of feelings. But because of the poverty, they were hiding their true feelings, ingenious feelings, innocent feelings, and shame. They were not able to quench it. They were not able to drop their feelings. The feelings was always there in their heart. The third stanza says, or heap the shrine of luxury and pride. They do not have chance to use fancy and flattering words. Heap the shrine of luxury and pride. That means they do not have chance to use fancy and flattering words because they have never learned. They were away from knowledge. In the previous stanzas, we saw that the knowledge was unrolled for them. That means they could not get knowledge. So now they do not have the chance to use fancy, luxury, fancy, and flattering words. And the last line says, with incense kindled at the muses' flame. Here the word muses. Muses were the 9 daughters of Zeus. And these muses were regarded as the inspiration for the writers to write their work. If I take the example of John Milton, you may remember that when John Milton was writing Paradise Lost, he invoked some muses to help him writing Paradise Lost. Can you name that name of that muses?
Urania.
Urania. Very right.
Yes,
Urania. Yes,
Urania. So Milton called the muses Urania to help him writing the Paradise Lost. So here also the same muses is used by Thomas Gray. And he says that they never lit incense. Incense means fragrant stick, agarbatti. So they never lit incense to the muses. They never prayed to the muses. They never asked muses to help them in inspiring their art. They never lit incense to the muses. The muses were the Greek goddess who were responsible for inspiring the artists, musicians, and poets so that they can increase their knowledge and strength. So these people have never lit any incense, any fragrant stick to the muses, so that the muses can give them knowledge, or the muses can give them inspiration to write something. Got it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Tanmay, can you explain this stanza?
Yes, sir.
Please.
So in this stanza, the poets want to say that the struggling pangs of conscious truth twice, that the poets want to say us that the poor people who have a very tough truth of poverty, that means their poverty is so real to them that engineers saying that their situation is so bad due to the poverty that whatever their original feelings, original desire, they also hiding their heartfelt feelings and desires due to their poverty, or heed the siren thrill of luxury and pride. And even in this line, the poets want to say that they also have desires, like luxury desires and pride, but they did not get chance to thrive of that luxury, and even they are not get chance to chance for the pride, for their false pride and indigenous word. And the last line, with incense kindle at the muses' strength, as the sir has said that the muses were the Greek god, whose 9 daughters were prayed for any kind of good writings and everything. But there, but here the villagers were so poor that they were unable to pray any god with incense, that the God may bless them to write any great work or great poetry like that. Is that so?
Yeah, very right, very nice. Tanmay, thank you so much. You have brilliantly explained this. Okay, now moving on to the next stanza, very famous stanza. From the first line itself, far from the madding crowd. Can you remember some work that has been taken from
Yes,
this line?
Thomas
Hardy.
Hardy, sir.
Yes, very right. Thomas Hardy's novel Far from the Madding Crowd has been taken from the first line, where the poet says that far from the madding crowd, ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. Far from the madding crowd means these people were living far away from the mad people of the town, who were always crowded. They were living far away from the noises and the strife of the crowded city. Their sober wishes never learned to stray. Sober means realistic. Their realistic wishes never learned to roam on the city. They were not like a stray dogs who roam from one place to another in search of wealth and job. They were living a sequestered life. They were living an stagnant life, staying at one place. Sequester means stagnant life, or you can say secluded life. So they lived a stagnant life, and they were able to live their lives without making a lot of noise. They kept the noiseless tenor of their way. Their life was noiseless. They were not shouting. They were not creating any crowd like the people of the city. They kept always noiseless. They were never noticed by anyone. Wherever they remained silent. Noiseless tenor. I hope I am clear this stanza.
Yes, sir.
It is said, coined by Brahma Kumaris, that we are a peaceful, powerful, and happy soul. So villagers, they live close to nature, and they live life that is meant for by God. That is, we all human beings should live very peaceful, very calm, very happy life, because happiness comes from within. But the outward city people, they are so much accustomed, so much overpowered by the crowd of outside, that they cannot hear the inner peace. They cannot hear the inner sound of God or the consciousness. So here the poet very well, using the word crowd, the poet very well compares the contrasting lifestyle, the contrasting way of life, the proper way. How should our life be in a proper way as the villagers are living, and what is in today's life that is getting so much complex, so much crowded. So by crowd, the word, the main point word, the poet is comparing here the peaceful life of village people as well as the city people. Um, and as usual, here also this stanza is also no difference as this is ABBA. This is the ABA. This is the stanza sequence. And obviously, the first line is very much important, as Hardy has taken this line from as the title of his novel. And that's it, sir. That's I understood.
Okay, thank you, Manamita. Yeah, by adding your own emotions, you have really magnified the meanings of these lines. Very nicely explained.
I tried my best. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, dear. Okay, I'll move on to the next stanza. Okay, yet even these bones from insults to protect, some frail memorial still erected high, with uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculpture decked, implores the passing tribute of a sigh. The first line, yet even these bones from insults to protect. Bones means the dead bodies. The people who are under the grave, their dead bodies. These people are able to protect themselves from any insult because they are living in a stagnant place, one place. So they are able to protect them from any insult. Some frail memorials still erected high. Although they are secluded, they are stagnant, even though their memorial, their epitaph has been erected. But that memorial is a fragile one. It's a frail one. It's not that much beautiful like the upper class people or the rich people, but it is a frail one, fragile one. With uncouth rhymes, uncouth means unrefined or unpolished rhymes. On their epitaph, whatever is written, it is uncouth. It is not refined. It is not polished. Although some rhymes are there, but it is uncouth. And whatever the sculpture or some painting that is made on their epitaph, that is also shapeless. But even though it implores the passing tribute of a sigh, means if any outsider is passing by their epitaph, at least they will tribute a sense of sigh by looking at that epitaph. So, although these memorials are not that much fancy, but they still inspire an outsider or a passerby to pause for a minute and take a sigh. Any doubt in this stanza?
No, sir.
Okay, Nisha, can you explain this?
Sir, may I?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm not able to connect to Nisha.
Yes, sir. She is busy. So this entire poem is about the lives of that unrevealed identity of the poor people who are in their graveyard or in their tombstone. And this particular stanza is about the tombstone, sir, because in this tombstone, as the first line is telling, even these bones are the dead people, they are buried under the graves that is a kind of, they are protecting themselves from the insult. Their identity has gone, so they are not that much identified, or their insults are not identified or revealed. So these tombs are kind of the hiding place for them from their insults too. And even though all the insult or their identities were not revealed, but still there is a memorial for them in the form of tombstones, and they are erected high, or they are a kind of tribute to a site. And on their tombstones, whatever is written, it is not so much polished or not so much refined way, because all these peoples are what we are talking about is about the common people, and including some of the famous people, but the most of the people which we are talking, or which the poet is talking about, the only for the common people. So while he was talking about the common people, he is writing these lines, and in the tombstone, whatever is written is unpolished or unrhymed, or something scribbled like that, because all of the situation of their life is not that much appreciable. So it's a kind of just a whatever memorial is erected is just a passing tribute of a site. It's just a kind of negligence, what I felt from this passage.
Yes, very right,
Thank
very
you, sir.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Adding the same meaning to the next stanza also, this poem is just developing like a story. So now their epitaph is erected. In the previous stanza, we saw that epitaph is erected and some uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculptures are made. So what is exactly written on their epitaph? So the poet says that their name, their years, spelled by the unlettered muse. So what is written on the epitaph? Name and the year of death, birth and the year of death. That means the years are only written by the unlettered muse. Here is an irony used by Thomas Gray. Unlettered muse. Muse means the one who inspires someone to write something. So here muse is unlettered, means illiterate, and muse cannot be illiterate. So this unlettered muse is some country people who is illiterate and uneducated. He has written the name and the years, and that is the reason that these rhymes, these words are uncouth, they are unpolished. In the next line, he says, the place of fame and elegy supply. This is not the place of fame. He says that this is not the place of fame. Nobody comes here at his own just to visit this place. And this place does not supply elegy. No author has written elegy on these people because they are the common man. Nobody remembers them. And many a holy text around she strews. Here you can see the pronoun she has come. She indicates muses. Now the poet says that the same muses has produced lots of holy texts like Bible and all. Many holy texts around she strews. This muses has inspired many people to write the holy books. But here in case of these poor people, the muses is secluded, the muses is away, and their rhymes, their epitaphs has to be written by the illiterate people. So finally, the poet says that teach the rustic moralist to die. That means it teaches the moralist or the speaker himself to die for salvation. So when the muses inspire someone to write the holy book, it actually teaches the rustic moralist to die. Why? For salvation.
Sir, you were not audible properly. If you can repeat the meaning of the last line again.
Yeah, sure. See, in the previous stanza, we saw that their epitaph is erected, but the lines or rhymes written on the epitaph were uncouth, were unpolished. So here in this stanza, the poet says that what is exactly written on the epitaph and who had written this. So in the first line, he says that their name and the year of birth and death is spelled on the epitaph, and it is written by unlettered muse. Unlettered means uneducated or illiterate muse. Muse means here muse is some countryman who has written this. So here it's an irony used. Muse cannot be literate because muses are the element of inspiration to write. So here it's an irony used by Thomas Gray in this line. And this is the place of fame. He means to say nobody comes here. It is not a place of fame. And this place does not supply any elegy. No author writes about these people. No one writes about the elegy of these people. Although the muses, the same muses, has produced lots of holy text. So he says many holy texts around sea strews. The same muses has inspired many people to write the holy text. And what this holy text teaches? This holy text teaches the moralist to die. So when you read this holy text, it actually teaches the moralist to die for salvation. Got it?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Nisha, it's your turn.
Now I'm trying, sir.
Sure.
Their name, their years spelled by the unlettered muses, as you told us very well, sir. Unlettered muses are given here irony to the uneducated people who have written only their name and their years, nothing special written on their epitaph. The place of fame and elegy supplies means this is not the place of fame because they are the normal people, villagers only. And elegy supply means no elegy were written in their life. But we found many elegies written on the life of the main or famous people, written by some famous authors also. But since they are the normal villagers, no elegy were written on their lives. And many texts around these strews. In the first line, the poet Thomas Gray is saying the unlettered muses, but unlettered muses is irony here since because muses are the inspiration to write. So being muses, they are written so many holy texts, and holy texts are supposed to teach us to die to get the salvation. They teach to the rustic moralist to die means we the readers. What muses do? They inspire us to die for get salvation, sir. That's what I'm getting, sir.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You have been very nice.
Thank you,
Sir, sir,
Yes,
sir, I wanted to ask that in this second line, so the
Mhm.
place of fame and elegy supply. So my question is that though it is written by an uneducated muse, which is an irony, but then also it is a place of fame and elegy. Is the poet
No, he
trying
is
to say
telling
that?
that. No, he is telling that this place, the graveyard, is not a place of fame.
Okay.
He is talking about the graveyard. He says that this place is not a place of fame. And whoever the people who are buried here, nobody has written any elegy on them. So no elegy is applied to them. So you cannot find negation here, but it actually indicates in the negative sense.
Okay, okay. So, sir, also the encrypted thing on the tombstone has some holy text also written, which tells the people that one day even you would die. Is that they're trying to say in the last two lines?
No. Holy texts are not written on their epitaph. It is talking about the muses. He's telling here in the first line that this their name and the date of birth and years are written by unlettered muses. But he says in the next line that the muses actually supplies a lots of holy books. It is the duty of the muses to inspire the authors to supply the holy books. But that muses has not come here in this graveyard to supply their inspiration for the writers to write elegy or to bring fame to the place. So here is muses is used as an irony in the first line, and in the third line it is actually used for the muses.
So was it okay, my explanation?
Yes, yes, your expression was very nice.
Okay.
Suji, is it clear?
Yeah, okay, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, I'll move on to the next stanza. In the next stanza, we find that the poet says, "For who to dumb forgetfulness a prey, displeasing, anxious, being ever resigned, left the warm precincts of the cheerful day, nor cast one longing, lingering look behind." So at the last, you find one question mark. It's a rhetorical question that Thomas Gage asking at the end of this stanza. So here the speaker or the poet, after all, he asked the people that although the moralist goes for salvation, but in fact the people enjoy more in surviving rather than dying. So he says that for who to dumb forgetfulness a prey? Who is that dumb? Who want to die? For who? For surviving, for living. So actually want to say that even troubles and worries of life are more enjoyable in comparison to death. So he says that the pleasing, anxious, being ever resigned. It is anxious and pleasing. Troubles and worries of life are more pleasing and left the warm precincts of the cheerful day. That means the poor people who died because warm parts of the cheerful day. The cheerful day were warm. And the same regrets and the longings they are also having like the other people. The other people were also trying to live a longer life. The same way these poor people also have the same lingering and the same longing. But although they were going towards death, because death was inevitable, everyone has to face the death. But they were looking behind, lingering and look behind. They were looking behind to live some more life, to live one more day like the other people do. Am I clear?
So the last line. Nor cast one longing. Yes.
Okay. Nor cast one longing and lingering. Look behind. So here is a question. He is asking a rhetorical question that they were longing and lingering and not casting their eyes on death, rather than they were looking behind. They were not casting their eyes, they were not focusing their eyes on longing and lingering towards death. Rather, they were looking behind to live one more day, to live some more life, like the other people do. Clear?
Yes.
Okay, I'll move on to the next stanza. First, I'll finish it because if time allows, we will repeat this by you. Okay, moving on to the next stanza. On some fond breast, departing soul relies. Some pious drops the closing eye requires. Even from the tomb, the voice of nature cries. Even in our ashes, live their wonted fire. The first line says, on some fond breast, the parting soul relies. Here, poet want to say that even after the death, the dead souls are still there. Their soul relies. Their soul are still there. Where? In the heart of their loved ones. On some fond breast, the parting soul relies. They are still there in the heart of their loved ones, their relatives, their families. Even after death, their souls are still there. In the breast of some families, some loved ones. Some pious drops the closing eye requires. And after their death, some loved one tear will come out when they close their eyes. When these poor people die, there are some people, there are some loved ones who will close their eyes to drop the tears. Pious indicates the tears here. And then he says, even from the tomb, the voice of nature cries. So it is not only the family members who are crying, but when after they are buried, the nature even cries for them. The voice of nature calls them out from their graves. Even in our ashes leave their wonted fire. And he says that when we will die and when our ashes will be there, actually in our ashes, their wanted fires will be there. Their passion will be there in our ashes. Clear? Okay. He says that in the last line, even from the tomb, the voices of nature cries. That means when the people will die and they will be buried, even the nature will cry and they will, the nature will cry to take them out of the grave. And even in our ashes, that means when we will die and our body will turn into ashes, actually we will be inspired by their passion. Wanted fire means passion. So we will be living on in our graveyard because of their passion. Got it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, moving on to the next one.
Does that mean that the people who will cry for them would only be the nature?
Yes, yes, correct.
Okay.
Okay, the next stanza is, for thee, who mindful of the unhonored dead, those in these lines their artless tale relate. If chance by lonely contemplation led, some kindred spirit shall inquire thy fate. So very beautiful stanza. Here, thee means you. In the old English literature, thee and thou were used for you. So here you is actually the speaker. When he indicates you, means he says me. So he says for thee means for you or for me, who mindful the unhonored dead. He says that for me, I am aware. Or if he says, if for you, he is aware. Or mindful of the dead people who have not been honored with lots of monuments. The people who are buried here are not honored with lots of monuments. They have the unhonored death. Then he says, "Dost in this line." Dost means so. So in this line, now he indicates his poetry, the poetry which we are reading. So the poet says that now in this poetry, I am relating or memorizing their artless tale. I am relating or I am recounting their artless tale by writing these lines in this poetry. And then he predicts and imagines that if by chance, by lonely contemplation led, if by chance it may happen that these people or actually he's talking about himself. So he says that if by chance, by lonely contemplation led, if I remained lonely and I died and I remained lonely, lonely contemplation led, I remained lonely even after death, then some kindred spirit, kindred means family members. When we were reading the play Everyman, it's an old English drama, morality play, Everyman. There also there was a character kindred that indicated family members. So here also kindred indicates family members. So some kindred spirit means some of my family will come here to inquire thy fate, to inquire my fate. If I remain here lonely for a longer time after I am dead, I am buried. So someday some kindred spirit, some spirit of my family will come here and it will inquire my fate. And the meaning is not complete. You can find here a caesura. There is a comma at the end. That means indicates that here is a caesura. So the meaning moves on to the next line. But let me check if anyone has any doubt in this stanza. Should I move ahead?
Sir, is he trying to say that there would be some other people also dead like him who are not honored, and someone like him would ask about his fate also?
Yes, someone, when he will die, he is talking about his death. He said that if he dies and he remained lonely for a longer time here in this graveyard, so someday some kindred spirit, some family spirit will come and inquire the way I am inquiring these people.
So here thy also means my?
Actually, thy means you. Thee or thou or thy means you. You means actually he's talking about himself.
Yes, sir. So here thy also means my, his fate, no? The poet's
Yeah,
fate.
his fate, yes.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next stanza. Happily some hoary-headed swine may say, oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn, brushing with hasty steps the dews away to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. Now here hoary-headed means someone who is having a gray hair, and swine means a farmer, a poor farmer or a poor peasant. So here a new character is introduced by Thomas Gray here in his imagination. And he says that the gray peasant or the gray farmer would say about him if a random passerby happened to ask about him. Oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn. So the poet imagines that the old farmer will say, so what he will say? Brushing with hasty steps the dews away to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. I'll repeat the first two lines. In the first line, the poet continues to imagine what the grey peasant would say about him. Happily, some hoary-headed swine may say. So, if someone who is passing by my epitaph and he asks the question, he inquired about my fate. In the previous line, we saw that some kindred spirit will come to inquire thy fate. So he's saying that if I am dead, I am buried, and if some gray-haired man, some old farmer is standing like me, the way I am standing, so someday in the future, some old man, some old peasant will stand near my epitaph, and then some kindred spirit will come to inquire my fate. Then what that farmer will say, what that old man will say about me. Then the second line he says that oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn. It is dawn means dusk and dawn. So the poet imagines that the old farmer will say that at the noon, the speaker used to stretch out at the foot of old beech tree. But before that, he says that brushing with hasty steps the dews away to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. So he will say that this speaker or the poet used to walk on the dew on the hill, and his legs were brushing with the dews when he used to walk, brushing with hasty steps the dews away. So when he was walking with his steps, the dews were going away, the dews were going dry, to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. And when he was walking, it appeared that he is trying to meet the sun. And the land on the lawn, in which the lawn was on the land, and when he was walking, it seems that the land is going up towards the sun, and that poet is going to meet the sun. Here the sun indicates something like that. So when he was walking, when he walks, actually it seems that he is going to meet the sun, and the land, the lawn in which he is standing, that land is going up towards the sun. Am I clear? Or should I explain it again? If anyone having any doubt, you can ask me. I'll repeat it again, because now we are about to finish. I think 4, 5, 6 more stanzas are there. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next stanza. Okay, here there is one tree in this stanza. There at the foot of yonder nodding beech. Nodding beech. Beech is a type of tree here. So this beech tree is the favorite tree where the poet is standing all the time. Whenever he reaches the graveyard in the churchyard, he used to stay near this beech. So he says that the poet continues with the same imagination like the previous stanza, where he is imagining that what the old villager or the old peasant would say about him after his death. He imagines that the old guy will say that the speaker used to wander in the nearby woods. That beech tree is like a forest, it's a jungle. So the old farmer will say that speaker used to wander in the nearby woods. The wreaths its old fantastic roots so high, the roots of the tree. Now he's talking about the speaker would smile scornfully. And his listless length at noontide would he stretch and pour upon the brook that babbles by. That means the rates of its old fantastic roots so high. Yes, dear? I'm not getting you. Can you repeat, please? Your sound is not coming, dear. No, I'm not asking. I'm just explaining, dear. Okay. There at foot of yonder nodding beech. Yonder means wonder. So the speaker is moving on feet. Used to wander in the nearby woods that raised its old fantastic roots so high. The beech trees are having a fantastic roots that is gone inside so high, underneath the earth. His listless length at noontide would he stretch and pour upon the brook that babbles by. Here, the babbles by indicates that he is roaming around a stream, a water stream, a small river. Noontide means the small river, small stream. So he is making a visit, listless length, to a stream, to a small river, and he would stretch himself near the noontide and he pour upon the brook. Brook is again the symbol of a small river. So again he pour upon the brook and that babbles by. The tides or the waves of that stream or that water was moving away as he was stretching near that noontide or that river. Clear?
Yes, sir.
The next stanza is, hard by yon wood, now smiling as in scorn, muttering his wayward fancies, he would rove, now drooping, woeful wan like one forlorn, or crazed with care or crossed in hopeless love. So the poet continues with the same imagination about what the old villager would say about him after his death, and he imagines that an old guy will say, the old farmer will say, that the speaker used to wander in the nearby woods, hard by yon wood. So he will be the nearby wood of the leech trees, now smiling at his scorn. Simultaneously, the speaker would give a scornful smile. Scornful smile means the smiling with the eyes downward, not looking into the eyes and smiling. So this is like a scornful smile. So he mentions that the speaker used to wander in the nearby woods and sometimes used to give a scornful smile and muttering his wayward. Muttering means murmuring to himself, like a monologue. So murmuring to himself and his wayward, that means continue in ways. Fancies he would rove. So he will continue in his ways, in his fancies, the way he likes, the way he like the fancies, the same way he will go. But suddenly, it starts drooping. That means he suddenly starts losing all his energies. He starts drooping himself. He's losing all the energies. Woeful man. He's looking for sorrowful and sick-like man. He's losing the energy. He's going towards death, actually, I want to say. He's losing all the energies and looking, seeming like a sick man, like one forlorn. Forlorn means lonely and abandoned. So when he's losing his energies and looking like a sorrowful and sick man, actually he looks like he is abandoned. He is lonely or crazed with care. Or sometimes it seems that he has been taken that much care that he has gone mad. He has gone crazy. Or crossed in hopeless love. Or sometimes it looks that he was hopelessly in love with someone, but he did not return back the love. He did not get the love back. That's the hopeless love. So when he seems sorrowful and when he seems sick, it seems that he is gone crazy or mad with extra care, or he is hopelessly in love with someone who has not returned back his love. Am I clear?
Yes.
Okay, moving on to the next stanza. Now, this all lines are uttered by, who is uttering this line?
The grey-haired man.
Yes, hoary-headed or grey-haired swine or the grey-haired man. And he says that, and this is all in the imagination of Thomas Gray. He is just imagining that when I die, how the people will talk about me. So now the grey-haired man says that one morn I missed him on the customed hill. That means every day he used to see the poet, he used to see the speaker. But one morning he says that the speaker is missing. The hill on which the speaker used to walk, the leech tree, the wood where the speaker used to walk, now I cannot see him. He is missing from the customed hill. I miss the speaker from the hill, along the heath and near his favorite tree. It is the same leech tree. So now the grey-haired man is looking for the tree, his favorite tree, leech tree, that he might be near his favorite tree along the heath. But there also he cannot find the speaker. Heath means evergreen. So the tree or the forest which is evergreen, so he looks for the speaker or the poet at that his favorite leech tree. This is the same tree which is previously mentioned. Then he says that another came. That means the second day he could not see him. And the third day, that means another day came, nor yet beside the rail. That means another day came. Another day has passed, and yet he still cannot see the speaker by the rill. Rill means the small stream or the small river, which we have previously seen in the stanza. So he is looking at his favorite tree, he is looking at his favorite river, his favorite stream, but he cannot find the speaker anywhere. Nor up the lawn, then the grey-haired man looked for the speaker at the lawn, nor at the wood was he. He looked for him at the wood, at the forest, but at no place he can find the speaker. Again, here is a caesura, and that means the meaning of the line moves on to the next stanza. Am I clear? Now, here is the last stanza. The previous stanza is clear to all? Kindly say yes if it is clear. And
Yes.
yeah, okay,
Yes,
thank you. Okay. Then the next, that means the next day. What happens to the next day? With doses due in sad array. Means on the third day, on the second day he is missing the speaker. Now it's the third day. So the third day after the speaker did not appear, that this old man, the old gray-haired man, realizes that some funeral sounds is coming. Sad array. Funeral songs are being sung. So he realizes someone singing the funeral songs were played.
So
And
who
he's-
realizes that gray-haired man?
Gray-haired man, he is talking about the condition of all these things. For the last 3-4 stanzas, we are talking about all the statements of gray-haired man.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so he sees that some slow through the churchway path we saw him born. Churchway path. That means now he sees that some funeral songs are being sung, and he saw that the speaker was carried slowly as a dead body along the path to the church in a funeral procession. Churchway path. Now he's been taken from the church towards the graveyard. Now the speaker is dead. Approach and read the lay, for thou canst read. So the villager or the old hair man, gray-haired man, invites a random passerby. Approach and read. That means he asked him to read the epitaph, because the gray-haired man is illiterate. Because the gray-haired man is kindred of Thomas Gray. So, like Thomas Gray, he is also illiterate. He cannot read what is written on the epitaph after Thomas Gray is dead, after he is buried. So, he approaches someone, some outsider who is passing by to read, as he says that, for thou cannot read. That means, I cannot read. The gray-haired man cannot read what is written in the epitaph. The lay means the one who is lying here, he cannot read the epitaph of that man. So he is asking some passerby to read the epitaph that is engraved on the speaker's tombstone. Graved on the stone. That means the speaker's tombstone beneath one edge thorn. The tombstone that lies near the same thorn plant, the leech tree. So now the speaker is buried under his favorite leech tree. Leech tree is a aeon-aged thorn, old thorn plant. And now the outsider or the passerby comes and read the epitaph. So now the next 3 stanzas are about the epitaph that Thomas Gray has written. that his epitaph will look like this. These are the lines that the outsider reads as the epitaph. Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
the lines from the epitaph are again very important. So many times these lines has been asked in the exam. Even this complete epitaph was asked in the form of a passage in one of the exams. So now I'll read the epitaph where it says that here rests his head upon the lap of earth.
Sir, please don't mind, but I don't know why I'm unable to concentrate anymore.
Okay, if you think you can quit because last 12 lines are left, so I want to finish this today.
Is it very important?
Yeah, definitely very important.
Okay, then I will stretch.
I'll take just 5 more minutes and I'll finish it up. And these lines are very easy one now. He writes about his own epitaph as, here rests his head upon the lap of earth. Here it's a metaphor. So he says that this is the place where the speaker is resting his head on the ground in the lap of earth. Lap of earth is a type of a personification here. Earth cannot have a lap. So earth is given some human behavior, human virtues. So lap of earth means it's a personification. That means now this is the place where the speaker is resting his head on the ground, resting his head upon the lap of earth. A youth to fortune. So here the speaker calls himself a young man. That means he says that he will die young. A youth to fortune. And he says that by fortune he will be youth. And fame unknown. But by fame he will be unknown. So actually this shows about the author's attitude, that he never wanted to become fame, internationally acclaimed author. He always wanted to be a common man, like the common people about which he's talking. So he says that he will remain a fame unknown. But yes, he was having the youth to fortune. Definitely he was having the fortune. And because he never wanted fame, so we have read in the last class that he denied the poet laureateship. When the poem was published in 1951, in the 1957, he was awarded the poet laureateship and he rejected it, saying that he did not want to become a fame. So that thing already appears here in this line, where he says that a youth to fortune and fame unknown. And then he says that fair science frowned not on his humble birth. So he says that at least he is not a stranger to knowledge or science. Like the people who were lying in the churchyard, they were having the scarcity of knowledge. But for him, fair science has frowned. Enough knowledge is available to him. Enough science is available to him on his humble birth. In spite of his same origin or a poor class origin, humble origin, he is having the science. He is having the knowledge. And melancholy marked him for her own. Her is used for melancholy here. So he says that he was sometimes full of melancholy. And when he's writing the poem, in fact, he is in the melancholy form. And that is the reason he has put the title Elegy written in the country churchyard. In fact, elegy is actually written on the death of some particular person. But here there is no one actually who is dying. But the poet here is in melancholy. So he says here that he sometimes full of melancholy and depression. Melancholy marked him for her own. In the second stanza, he says that large was his bounty. and his soul sincere. That means he was humble, largely humble. Bounty means humble and generous. So he was humble and generous, and his soul sincere. His soul was very sincere and hardworking. Heaven did a recompense as largely sent. So his soul was sincere, and heaven paid him back for whatever the good qualities he had. If he is having a bounty and sincere soul, that means the heaven has paid him back for these good qualities. He gave to misery all he had. So whatever the quality he had, when he was in melancholy, he gave everything to misery. So here he says something philosophical things, that if you are in trouble, if you are in misery, if you are in melancholy, actually you lose all your good points, your positive points. So here he says that he gave to misery all he had, even a tear, and he gained from heaven a friend. So what the heaven has paid back? The heaven has paid back for his good deeds him a best friend. And some of the critics and historians say that this friend is actually Richard West. Richard West. So he gave Richard West as a friend, that is given by the nature, that is given by the heaven as a return for his good deeds. And here comes the last stanza of the poem, the last stanza of the epitaph, where he says that no farther seek his merits to disclose. So now these lines are for the reader who is reading the epitaph, and for every reader who is reading the poem. Then he says that no farther seek his merits to disclose. Don't try to find out anything, any merit more about this dead speaker, or draw his frailties from their dead abode, and do not try to dig out his frailties or his bad points. Like in Hindi we say gade murda mat ukhado. So or do not draw the frailties from his dead abode. Why? Because they are alike in trembling hope repose. Whether it's a good habit or a bad habit, both are the same, because now they are trembling hope repose. They are resting at peace. Good habits are also resting at peace. Bad habits are also resting at peace, because the poet is dead now. So the bosom of his father and his God. Because both his both his good and bad points are now resting, and he is hoping for eternal life. He wants to get the salvation now, and he wants to go and remain in heaven with his God, his Father, in the bosom of his Father, in the lap of his Father and his God. He wants to live an eternal life now. So this is all about the Elegies in a Country Churchyard. We have finished this poem, and it took around 3 days to complete this poem. But there was certain reason behind that. One is this poem is very, very important. The second reason is, by looking at this poem, we can understand the entire imagery and the style of this neoclassical age and the transition age that is passing by. And most of you have, might have read this poem in your graduate and postgraduate, but some of you have left the studies years ago, so that might be missing from your mind. So it's type of good refresher, isn't it?
Sir, you taught
Yes,
us
sir.
very well. You know, even in your university, they did not teach us it in depth the way you did. So it is all embossed in our mind now, the way you taught us.
Yeah, I'm very sure that if any question from any nook and corner of this poem they ask, you'll be able to reply.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So by this way, in every age, we will be discussing one poem in detail, so that we can have the complete understanding of the stylistics, imagery, and the theme of all the poems.
And how to interpret the poem. For us.
Yeah. See, tomorrow I am going to give you one assignment of 20 marks, where you have to describe this poem as non-elegiac poem. So this will be a home assignment for everyone. You have to write 3-4 pages on explaining why this poem is a non-elegiac. Although the title is elegy, but you have to explain it. You have to critically analyze it that it's a non-elegiac poem.
Good idea,
Okay.
sir. To make us work.
Now, by this way,
Thank
you
you,
will be able to critically analyze and interpret the poems.
Yes, sir. We need it. We need it.
Yes.
It is
So,
some advanced level of studies now.
see, nowadays you have very nicely seen the questions. If you are reading the objective question, you'll never pass the exam until you go inside the depth, inside the cave,
True, sir.
and you find out every marbles, dig out the marbles. Then only you can solve the question.
Yes, sir. Helpful for MSQs in GATE.
It definitely
Multiple
for
sentence.
yes. MSQs, they are going to ask questions like this only. So if you critically analyze and write 3-4 pages about that, that will be really, really brilliant. And you will be able to write your PhD thesis and all, every research paper and all. So if you critically analyze and write, it is really very helpful.
Okay,
Okay,
so
so
we will write.
yeah, so I'll be sending the question in your mailboxes. Although the objective questions are already reached, but apart from that, this will be an extra question, 20 marks, where you have to write 3 to 4 pages explaining why it is not an elegiac poem. Critical analysis of this poem.
Sir,
Okay, sir.
hello.
Yes, dear.
Sir,